Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Venice's online Sunday morning worship. We're actually coming to you from the softening shadows of Reverend Van Zant's pool deck. This morning, the coronavirus has asked us to adapt, and we're still adapting. I'm Reverend Dennis McCarty, and we're unable to gather in person, but I sincerely welcome you to our online service. I have been informed that some folks who actually live a long way from Venice, Florida, and are not necessarily even members of the congregation, are clicking into these services. So if you're watching and you get anything that feeds you intellectually or spiritually, you might think about sending a small check to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Venice. You can find our website at www.uucov.org. And if you're watching this, maybe you've already found it, but like every small business in this time of COVID-19, some of the challenges we face are financial, and we'll gratefully accept any help we can get. For members, also, be sure to check out your Friday Happenings email. It's one way we're staying in contact. We share joys and concerns there and other information. Our lives do go on even during pandemics, and we're, again, just adapting as we go. And Friday Happenings, the way it's changing, is another one of our adaptations. And finally, because, of course, a video service does lack the element of interaction, members are invited to our 11 o'clock Sunday morning coffee hour time for sharing celebrations and sorrows. We do it via Zoom, of course, and your Happenings email will have the Zoom invitation. And as you probably know, Zoom changed the rules on us last week in the middle of the weekend and required a password, but that will be included with the Zoom invitation in this week's Happenings email, I promise. Or I guess it already was included, because if you're watching this, it's after Sunday morning, but now I'm confusing myself. So, adaptations are us. Now let us prepare to reflect and celebrate. I'm going to begin with a responsive reading, number 563 from the Gray Hymnal, actually. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a person will worship something. And I'll read the one part, and I invite you to respond in the bold-faced many parts. A person will worship something, have no doubt about that.
We may think our tribute is paid in secret in the dark recesses of our hearts, but it will out.
That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will determine our lives and character.
Therefore, it behooves us to be careful what we worship, for what we are worshiping, we are becoming.
I'm going to light the chalice. It's a little breezy out here this afternoon. We'll see if it bravely stays lit. I invite you to join in singing, if you're so inclined, our opening hymn, number 203 in the Gray Hymnal, All Creatures of the Earth and Sky.
Swift rushing winds so wild and strong, white clouds that sail in heaven alone. Hallelujah, hallelujah, fair rising morning, praise rejoice. High star of evening, find a voice. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Cool flowing water, pure and clear, make music for all life to hear. Hallelujah, hallelujah, dance flame of life so strong and bright, and bless us with your warmth and light. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
Our first reading comes from the Gospel according to Mark. It's Easter. We're being very traditional here. While Jesus was being beaten in the high priest's palace before being taken to the cross, Peter was down below in the courtyard. One of the high priest's servant girls saw Peter warming himself there and stared at him and said, "You too were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But Peter denied it. "I do not know him. I do not understand what you're talking about," he said. And he went into the forecourt, and the servant girl saw him again and started telling bystanders, "This fellow is one of them." But again, Peter denied it. A little later, one of the bystanders said to Peter, "You must be one of them because you are a Galilean." And at this, Peter started to curse and said with an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." And at that moment, the cock crowed for the second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had told him at their last supper together, "Before the cock crows twice, you will have denied me 3 times." And Peter put his face into his hands and burst into tears. And to me, the verses out of Mark where Peter 3 times denies that he even knows Jesus are some of the most heartbreaking in all of literature. How many times has it happened? How many times have you or I done it? Like Peter, we might even call ourselves friends and allies. But when the crowd turns, when the jeers and even the blows begin, how tempting it is to slip quietly, silently away and leave the persecuted to their fate. The children in cages on the border, the Jews in cattle cars rattling eastward toward Auschwitz, the innocent black youths dragged out of Depression-era jail cells and strung on trees or burned with fire, or merely in our day, the denial of employment to someone different in the wrong way. Easter is a time for us to witness. Passover too, a time for us to witness. And it does not matter, Christian, Jew, agnostic, atheist, it was never about what you or I believe or disbelieve. It was about the sacred challenge to lift up, rise up, call out to the crowd, "I am with this person you would persecute. We are with these people you would persecute." It's so easy to be allies, to be warriors for justice when no one is looking. If our religion means a thing, it calls on us to witness with the disadvantaged, even when the crowd heaps scorn for doing so. Easter, Passover, they are seeds of memory for all of us as witnesses, not just as believers or non-believers. And our choral response is the traditional melody, number 381, but new words. Humanity be ours to share, the worth of people everywhere. Let decency become our creed, and justice ours in word and deed. Our second reading is from the Gospel according to Luke. Then Jesus looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. And blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. And blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day, and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven. For that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your consolation. And woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. And woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. And woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets." Many years ago, as an undergraduate, I was introduced to the most influential English poet, Geoffrey Chaucer, who was writing in the Middle Ages when English was a very different language. And eventually, because he's in the public domain now, I can do this. Eventually, I developed a practice of taking the prologue to his Canterbury Tales, which takes place in April, around Easter time, and setting it to music and doing it every year, sometime during the month of April, and this seems to be as appropriate a time as any. So, Chaucer's Prologue. One April with the shore is sota, the drocht of March hath persed to the rota, and bothered every vein and switch liqueur, of which whereto engendered is the floor. When Zephyros ake with his sweet breath, in spirit hath and every hold on death, the tendre croppes and the young sun hath in the ram his halve course run, and small a fool a smaken melody, that slepen all the nicht with open ear, so pricketh him nature in your courages, then longen folk to gon on pilgrimages. And Palmerus for to second stround just strondus, to fern the always couth in sundry landus, and specially from every shiros end of England to Canterbury they vend, their holy blissful mater for to sake, that him hath holpen when that they were sake. And the words mean, the month of April has a sweet, sweet rain that showers down on mountain, heath, and plain. It soaks into the ground like heaven's wine, and gives birth to the flower and the vine. The gentle breezes kiss across the land, caress new planted crops with loving hands. The air is fresh and sweet, and everyone goes forth anew beneath a smiling sun. The little birds all lose themselves in song and sleep with both eyes open all night long, because the season's joy excites them so. And that's when folk on pilgrimages go. The rich set sail unto the land of palms to pledge devotion and to give their alms, while lesser folk of England turn their feet toward Canterbury to show their faith complete. To Thomas Becket's grave they make their way, the saint whose love can heal the sick, they say. Befell there him that says anon die, in Zuther at the tabard as he lie, full ready to wend on me pilgrimage toward Canterbury with full devout courage. At Nick was common to their hostelria, full 29 in a compagnie of sundry folk be aventure fall in fellowship, and pilgrims were they all. They chanced to fall into fellowship, and pilgrims were they all. as are we all, by choice, not chance, but in fellowship, by diverse paths, pilgrims to a common destination. Easter is a complex time for me. On one level, of course, it's as much pagan as Christian. Rabbits and eggs are not Christian symbols. The very name, Easter, refers to a celebration of Estra, the pagan goddess of fertility and spring. But growing up in a Christian household, Easter was a big deal to us. My mother was hardly naive about Christianity's pagan borrowings, but she took them in stride. And I remember evenings when we would gather around the kitchen table and Mom would read aloud from the family Bible. My father quoted the Gospels too. So often, Jesus almost seemed like a family member at times. The rebirth of spring was important, but so were the courage, sacrifice, and resurrection of Jesus. At the Unity Church we attended, a large painting of Jesus hung in the basement Sunday school. He had a thin, elegant nose, blue eyes, and long sandy hair brushed till it gleamed. He looked as though he came from Copenhagen, not Nazareth. As a child, though, I felt safe and comfortable with that image of Jesus. No one knows exactly what Jesus looked like or even exactly what he said. The four Gospels, the stories of Jesus' life, were written by four different people at four different times, and a generation passed after Jesus' death before the first one, Mark, was written down. The others came one by one over the next 25 years. And in the process, such legends as the Christmas story, the virgin birth, and the wise men, etc., got added. They're not in the oldest Christian writings, including the letters of St. Paul, which are the oldest Christian writings of all. Matthew, his gospel saw Jesus as confirmation of Jewish prophecy, so he emphasized the Jewishness of Jesus. 20 years later, the last gospel, John, emphasized the non-Jewishness of Jesus. Matthew was trying to impress Jews. John portrayed Jews as villains. Meanwhile, Luke emphasized Jesus' divinity and zeal for justice, and that's why I read Luke's version of the Beatitudes rather than Matthew's better-known version. The first three Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, say Jesus threw the moneylenders out of Jerusalem's temple the final week of his life. That's what got him arrested. John says it happened much earlier at the beginning of his ministry, and only John has Jesus riding into Jerusalem on palm leaves spread by his admirers. The others say it was just leafy branches. But Palm Sunday sounds better than Leafy Branch Sunday, so tradition follows John on that one. But we miss the point a bit if we get so lost in the historical detail, fascinating though they are, that we throw out the real insight and inspiration in the New Testament. Atheist though I am, it holds teachings, insights, ethical lessons that I still cherish. Any gripe I have is more about the distortions that took place later, as Christian leaders were adapting to the politics of the Roman Empire. Jesus' real ethics began to take a back seat to church politics. You couldn't blame other traditions for fighting back with literary creations of their own, and at least one Jewish writer fought back with a particularly Jewish weapon, satire. As Christianity became Rome's state religion and persecution of Jews increased, someone wrote a brutal takedown called the Toldoth Jesu. It's not among standard Jewish literature. It was never meant to be, I don't think. Church authorities would burn every copy they could get their hands on, and probably along with the people they caught with the copies. The Toldoth Jesu starts with a crafty fellow named Joseph Pandara, Joseph the pimp, seducing Jesus' mother through trickery, Mary, Her real husband walks out on her, and Jesus is born under the most shameful circumstances. And he grows up as a highly intelligent, charming boy, but like his father, he is also very sneaky. In early Jewish traditions, God's name was not to be written down or spoken, but in the Toldoth Jesu, Jesus finds out that God's full name is carved into the foundation stone in the sanctuary of the temple in Jerusalem. The ineffable name, the story calls it, and if a person learns God's name, they will gain unlimited magical powers. But the entrance to the holy sanctuary is guarded by 2 magical brass hounds, so that even if someone does manage to sneak in and learn the ineffable name, the hounds will bay as the thief passes, frightening the person into forgetting everything. Jesus sneaks into the holy sanctuary with a knife, a pen, and some parchment. And he writes the ineffable name on the parchment and then slices open his own thigh and hides the paper in the wound. The hounds do frighten him, and he does forget the word, but once he gets away, he removes the parchment from the wound in his thigh, relearns the ineffable name, and becomes magical. First, he heals his own leg, and then he travels around claiming to be God, doing magic tricks, stirring up all kinds of trouble. Temple officials realize the ineffable name has been stolen, so they hire a second thief to bring Jesus to justice, namely Judas Iscariot. Judas also steals the ineffable name, gains magic powers of his own, and engages Jesus in a furious magical duel, flying about, wrestling with one another in the air. Judas finally wins, Jesus loses his magical powers, and after further adventures, he is captured and justly executed. Now, if you find this story offensive, it is. And the full story is even worse than the quick summary I just gave. But then again, Jews have a long history of using satire to skewer their tormentors. And anti-Semitism was even more vicious in the Middle Ages than it is today. And looking from that point of view, the scathing nature of the Toldoth Jesu becomes understandable. And as far as that goes, is that all that much farther from historical reality than that blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus in my Sunday school? From ancient Rome to modern televangelists, people have always depicted Jesus in ways that serve their own purposes. There's one more. In the 1860s, many Koreans were converting to Catholic Christianity. While working in Korea, I visited a Catholic shrine, Cheoldu-san, it's called, on a hill above the Han River in Seoul. The name means Hill of the Martyrs. In the 1860s, Europe and the United States were forcing Korea to open its markets to trade with the West. French gunboats forced their way up the Han River to the capital, Seoul, and Korea's regent, Daeungun, took out his revenge on Korean Catholics. His troops rounded up every Catholic they could find, tortured them, and beheaded them on this hill overlooking the river. Korea wound up with more Catholic martyrs than any other nation in the world. Cheoldu-san is a beautiful place now, with gardens and a museum and a gift shop, and in the gift shop you could buy carved wooden statuettes of a Korean-faced Jesus or a Korean-faced Virgin Mary wearing traditional Korean hanbok clothes. Now, to me, that was jarringly different from the Nordic Jesus of my childhood, but that would be a Jesus that Korean children could feel safe with. And this cultural, religious sense of Jesus is bigger than any single cultural way of depicting him. Somewhere in between that Nordic Jesus of my childhood and the Asian Jesus of Cheoldu-san, I developed a growing respect for the Jesus who inspires me. I am an atheist, but I am also a student of the human condition. I still find the Gospels a worthy read. Examination does reveal contradictions and stories that are very unlikely to be true, but there's also wisdom and insight into the human condition. As a matter of fact, some of the most wonderful wisdom is in sections that weren't even in the oldest scriptures, but that's a different story. This being Easter, I'll acknowledge that traditional Christian theology does tell us Jesus had to be sacrificed to atone for the sins of humanity. But I agree with the theologians, including 19th century Universalist Hosea Ballou, who hold that no loving God would sentence anyone to torture and death for the crimes of somebody else. Moment. At least it was just wind for saying that, not lightning. Fact is, Jesus' death was all about power. In an age when brutality was standard legal practice, crucifixion was a common way for the powerful to intimidate people. For example, when Rome put down the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, Roman soldiers crucified captured rebels 500 a day, day after day, till the hills around Jerusalem were stripped of trees to make crosses with. Crucifixion was standard punishment for traitors, slaves, and nobodies. And that's what Jesus was in real life, a nobody who inconvenienced the authorities. His death is meaningful to me precisely because it was so business as usual. He was a piece of grit in the teeth of the economically and politically powerful to be got rid of as efficiently as possible, and that's exactly what they did. Now, there are two versions of the series of blessings I quoted called the Beatitudes. The better known one is found in what's called the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. The other, the one I used, it comes from what's sometimes by scholars called the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. They're rather different from one another. Serious scholars doubt either one took place exactly the way they're described, but Jesus probably did teach such things, and the Beatitudes form the ethical center of his message. They're worth reading just by themselves. The oldest gospel, the first gospel to come along, was Mark, and Mark draws Jesus rather as a bristly sort of fellow. He followed a long line of biblical prophets who preached justice and warned the rich and powerful that they would ultimately be called to account. And that's why I used the reading from Luke, with Jesus saying, "Woe to the rich and the well-fed." But when he invaded Jerusalem's temple and personally confronted the profiteers, and all four Gospels agree that he did do that, he sealed his own fate. He was too much of a troublemaker to be allowed to survive. What's important is that he left behind not just followers and a supernatural legend, but also ethical and human insights which still inspire and enlighten thoughtful people today. Over the centuries, those have included Unitarians and Universalists from the mountains of Transylvania to medieval Poland to colonial New England. You don't have to believe in the supernatural to think justice and human insight are good things. And that's the vision of Jesus that inspires me. And I might add, and here I'll go back to Matthew's version of the Beatitudes, which are better known and more poetic. The original Greek scripture, original Greek writing, says nothing about the meek inheriting the earth. That came from a mistranslation in the King James Bible in 1611. The actual Greek word prautes means gentle strength, or strength that is under control and tinged with caring. And I suspect that mistranslation is just one more example how the powerful have always distorted the Christian message. The King James Version was commissioned by England's most powerful people, namely the king. They were not interested in being strong but gentle, but in being as strong and vicious as it took to stay in control, total control. But they thought it would be helpful if the citizenry were meek. And it's not surprising that the call to meekness got slipped in, but the earliest depictions of Jesus were anything but. Matthew goes on, "Blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." Now those verses are more than just beautiful poetry. They call us to a way of life which is both ethical and difficult. Peace is more difficult than war. Mercy is more difficult than anger or vengeance. Gentleness requires much more discipline than taking advantage. Jesus understood the shadow side of human nature, the gift we have for tricking ourselves, particularly when it's to our own advantage. And he talked a lot about hypocrisy and self-deception. It is much easier to condemn a minor flaw in someone else, the sawdust in our neighbor's eye, than to own up to our own shortcomings, the splinter in our own eye. As a Zen teacher would say, the mind is a clever monkey. It plays tricks on us so that we do ignore our own faults while we comment on the faults of others. Jesus would have been a great Buddhist in a lot of ways, living 500 years before Jesus, dedicated to a life of reflection and right action. Maybe Buddha could have been the first small c Christian, just with a different mythology. Just a thought. To this atheist, what makes Jesus worth considering is that he saw through the little mental games we play with ourselves. He showed compassion for the people society still looks down on today: beggars, prostitutes, tax collectors, foreigners. He demanded that proper people and the privileged take a good hard look at ourselves rather than judging the marginalized. Economically and politically powerful people killed the human Jesus 2,000 years ago, and such people still warp his message and take good care of themselves in our time. You won't get crucified anymore for standing up to them, just condemned and maybe thrown in jail for a couple of nights. Times have improved. And I suspect it is tempting to worship Jesus as God while at the same time neglecting the message and the self-discipline he actually tried to teach: courageous, self-demanding, getting into the faces of the rich and powerful. There's a reason fundamentalists sing hymns about a Jesus who loves and understands us better than our families and who will punish everybody we don't like. But I do have to add, I've also talked with plenty of liberal Christians who find that version of Jesus just as problematic as I do. I included Mark's account of Peter claiming not to know Jesus this morning because if we truly care about covenantal behavior and just and loving treatment of one another, that also gets us to a crucial piece of the human condition. Interpretations of that passage vary from scholars who consider Peter a coward, not witnessing the divinity of Jesus, to others who say Peter was brave and probably planned to try to rescue Jesus later. But as I put in my meditation, I consider it one of the most complex and also one of the saddest passages anywhere. If Jesus was about standing up for the least among us, the story of Peter illustrates just how difficult it is to do that in the real world. It's easy to talk about human rights and social responsibility. It's easy to donate money and goods out of our own abundance. But the passage from Mark reminds us how difficult it is to stand by someone the crowd hates, to stand up in the face of the crowd and to tell the crowd they're wrong. I think any of us have stayed silent at one time or another. When someone told a racist or sexist or homophobic joke, it's easier to call someone on that now than it was a generation ago, but it can still be a challenge. It's becoming easier to stand up to blatant homophobia or transphobia today, but it's still not always easy. And when refugees from outside our border are abused and taken advantage of in a variety of ways, that can go on in near silence. The story of Peter challenges us to stand and speak our minds on behalf of the marginalized in full knowledge of the risks. So, freethinker though I may be, I am still challenged by the Gospels to be courageous in the face of my own fears and weaknesses, to get out of my own rationalizations and my own prejudices, because I find I still have them. And to me, that's the message of Jesus that doesn't need resurrection because it never died. I don't think we need to call Jesus God. We simply need to struggle to lead the life he called us to live. And that's the Easter message for me. Amen. May it be so. And I invite you to join in singing our closing hymn this morning, Faith of the Larger Liberty, number 287.
Faith of the larger liberty, source of the light expanding, law of the church that is to be, old bondage notwithstanding. Faith of the free, by thee we live, by all thou givest, and shalt give, thy loyalty commanding. Heroes of faith in every age, sparsing, self-denying, wrought an increasing heritage, monarch and creed defying. Faith of the free, bring thy dear name, the costly heritage we claim, then living and denying. Faith from the people everywhere, whatever their oppression, of all who make the world more fair, living their faith confession. Faith of the free, whate'er our plight, thy law, thy liberty, thy light, shall be our blessed possession.
It is precisely in the most difficult times that aspiration becomes most important. May we once again bask in the goodness of life and in the worthiness of our fellow human beings. May we rejoice in labors of love, and may they once again bring forth the fruits of useful living. May we continue to seek and create an ordered and righteous church and community, furthering the deserts of all, seeding and ultimately harvesting the best hope of human destiny. Shalom, salam, blessed be, and amen. And we'll close by singing number 123, Spirit of Life.
fire.